On the agenda tonight, Donal Logue and I are going to be discussing country music, Glen Campbell, Roy Clark, among many other things. Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another video. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. So a couple of weeks ago, I was joined by Donal Logue, the actor, producer, writer, and we were looking at Rory Gallagher. We also spoke about many other topics, one of which is going to be featured tonight. Actually, a few things will be featured in the chat because we go down a lot of different avenues, but it's mostly around country music and Glen Campbell and Roy Clark. Merle Haggard's in there as well, and Dolly Parton's name gets mentioned. So there's a lot of stuff in there. We'll jump straight into the video, and for reference, we were talking about Jerry Reed, so that's where Donal's going to pick it up.
Jerry Reed became popular here later for doing these movies with Burt Reynolds.
Yeah. And
so people thought he was this kind of Southern funny man and stuff. And I mean, for people who certainly watched, you know, in the mid 70s, there were a lot of variety shows. And on a lot of them, they would have Chet Atkins and Glen Campbell and people playing together. And people who knew that Jerry Reed was this incredible guitar player. But outside of, you know, there was back then, I would say, the people who like country.
Yeah.
And the people who like the rock, and they didn't know. And this is a really cool forum where you're just kind of opening up. I really love how you opened it wider for even Dolly Parton or, you know, so many different, you know, there's so many different, you know, it's Django Reinhardt or different people who have influenced so many people. It's just, yeah, it's great. I saw Merle, I think in 79 or 1980 at this place, the Lakeside Rodeo, like an old rodeo place outside of San Diego. Yeah. And of course, he was incredible. Yeah. You know, he was just, you know, and apparently, you know, people think that Johnny Cash was in Folsom. Johnny Cash played music in Folsom. Merle Haggard was in Folsom when Johnny Cash played because he had robbed a car, you know, he had stolen a car. Merle Haggard was the dude. Yeah. And so, but no, and like you pointed out, there must have been, and there still is, I'm sure, you can throw a stone in any direction in Nashville and hit 100 guitar players who are incredible. Like those guys just are technically the best. And even all my punk rock friends, even all these great guitar players, and those might be someone to look at in the future. There was a guy from Washington, D.C. called Brian Baker who was in a band called Dag Nasty, but he ended up being in Bad Religion, all these other bands. But there was a lot of really good guitar players from that era, but they all loved Glen Campbell. Yeah. Before I wasn't really aware of Glen Campbell, other than I knew him from being kind of a TV personality at that point and stuff. But I wasn't aware of how insane the Wrecking Crew was and what, you know, Glen Campbell's contributions as a guitar player. He's like amazing. And no wonder all those great 60s hits, like none of the record labels let the bands play any of their music. Yeah. Like, we've got the people who are going to be playing on the record. It's all done. Yeah.
And that's the other thing about Glen is he was, you know, part of the Wrecking Crew, but when you're looking at it from the perspective of the standard musicians in the studio who had been maybe training their whole lives or reading music and they'd been educated to go down that avenue, so we show you what to play and you play it. And then you've got Glen Campbell who's approaching it from the direction of not knowing anything musically from reading sheet music to just hearing it and playing it to the same level that these guys are reading it, but doing it all in his head and hearing it. So he must have had such an amazing ear, probably on a level that you know couldn't be equaled by anybody, to take a session level appreciation of music and not having to read it, but being able to replicate that just from hearing it and playing the guitar. And it's something that, yeah, on the video that I did on Glen Campbell, I think a lot of people will know him from, you know, Gentle on My Mind and singing that song because of his vocal, because he was so talented as a vocalist. And when people are listening to it on the radio, they hear a singer. And when you then actually dive into it and you think, hang on, not only can this guy play, but this guy is a ridiculously good player with everything, with country music, the jazz lines that he threw in there, his synchronizations off the charts, left hand, right hand, alternate picking, economy picking. There's so much in there from guitar players that would look into it and see so much technique. But all of this time he's playing and smiling and having a great delivery of a vocal, and that's where people are focusing on. But like we said earlier, once you start to dig beneath the surface, you can now appreciate it on such a deeper level of what a well-rounded artist he was. But being a session level at any instrument is just massively impressive, especially considering that he's just doing it all from it, well, by ear, effectively.
Right. And besides just being an incredible musician and guitar player and singer, and having that kind of that look, and to be the guy who sang, like, Wichita Lineman, generally speaking, here in the United States is considered the greatest pop song in the last 50 years or something. It's such a it's so weirdly poignant and haunting and strange, and that he was the guy that did it. And you know, not that Glen wrote it. I'm not being mistaken here, right? Glen didn't write it.
No, Glen didn't write it.
But that, you know, because a lot of times that those packages don't add up to being the guy who's standing on top of the mountain with the one song that is kind of on every radio in that year in the United States. And you know, it was interesting. And then, like I said before, with Jerry Reed and even, you know, all those guys, there were so many variety shows on television in America in the 70s, or Hee Haw was one of them with Buck Owens. Yeah. But you'd forget that these people had a really intense musical background, because it started melting into this kind of variety show comedy hour bits and stuff. And so you'd think that they were just kind of a TV star or media personality, but no, they were incredibly great. They were great.
I did a video on Roy Clark as well. And actually Roy Clark and Glen Campbell, I think I did one on as well. And another example of a guy who I think in the modern day would be seen as a TV presenter or TV personality. But then when you dive into his playing on the guitar, there's nothing that you can say to explain how good he is at playing. All of his techniques. And people got thrown off the scent because of the comedy and the light-hearted element that he'd throw in there. And especially when he would be actually playing really technically difficult stuff, but with a smile on his face and pulling faces as if he's struggling to do it. But he's playing an acoustic guitar perfectly clean. And it's these kind of guys like Glen who had this skill set that was so wide that people didn't really take in what was going on instrumentally that was at such a high level.
It was so interesting back then in that era in the United States, because I don't know what the push was in terms of the cultural zeitgeist, but clearly, and it might have started before, even with Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra and those guys, where they had these kind of comedy variety shows. They had each other on, or it was, you know, comedians but it happened with, like you said, Roy Clark. And I think you may have shown this before, Roy Clark, or they would do stunt casting and be like, Roy Clark, for no apparent reason, is on an episode of The Odd Couple. And he's like Oscar's friend, who happens to play killer kind of flamenco style guitar, but with a pick or something, you know, but it's Roy Clark doing his thing. And there was like, but it's hard for us. It was even more limited in England at the time, because there was, I don't know if there was only 2 channels at that time in the 70s, but we only had 3. And so there was such limited amount of television time, and everybody in the country was absolutely watching whatever the 3 shows were that night. And then they would bring in, but you have Johnny Cash would have a show, and it was the kind of thing where he was so generous of spirit. And of course, like if Chris Christopherson came by, or even I think her name is like Melanie, Melanie, who sang Candles in the Wind. She's another really great artist I like. But every time they would find artists that they liked a lot and bring them on and just be so generous and introduce them to the broader American audience who were there for a little bit of laughs, some cool music. But it was, you know, just the whole, I don't know, it was unique the way it was all kind of laid out and presented. But it was so, like you said, there always had to be a wink, and there always had to be like a laugh track in the middle of it or something. And while these guys are throwing down so hard the whole time, but you know, but that was also, it's probably like Irish music, you know, that was kind of jigs and reels and bluegrass and you know, just that thing where people are jamming in an Irish pub in a session. And someone's like, oh, he's got his father's fingers, you know. And that's what Jerry Reed, they were always commenting on each other's playing in the middle of it. We're like looking over and go, woo-wee, man, yeah, you know, and they were supportive and really cool. And I love it when you point that out. You pointed that out between, I think it was Chet and Mark Knopfler too. It's impossible for when those types of talents are sitting with each other that they don't just go, damn, look at this, you know, smile or have a reaction when someone's doing something really neat. So
yeah, I think that's the thing, that everyone, no matter how they are perceived as a guitarist, as an artist, they have somebody who was an idol or is an idol to them. So you do occasionally get guitarists who have had an idol and now they're playing with them, and you can see that even though the guitarist that you might be looking at is seen as a god or something at playing, they have somebody that they think that of. And then when they meet up, you get those magical moments where the guy who everyone would kill to play like is massively overwhelmed by the other guy that he's watching. And that is what music is all about, that you can have so many different artists that have so many things in common, but also are wildly different. And they will be into music that is totally off the beaten path, that they will have idolized when they were younger, and then they actually get to meet that person. And sometimes it might even be the case that the person that everybody knows that might have the reputation or the fame was really into an unknown guitarist, and they just want to get into, or they want to meet that guitarist that inspired them. And it's great when you hear these little stories, like you said, knowing the background and being a fly on the wall in all of these different things that have happened in the past between so many top guitarists that all share things in common, and at some point they've crossed paths in the past that have meant they got to where they got because they were inspired by a particular guitarist they looked up to, who took the time to speak to them or explain something to them. And you know, that is what it's all about, and just sharing ideas musically and doing anything. If you know, Link Ray and Dick Dale and stuff, they were the guy. Those are the guitar players who, just a generation of guitar players were like, those guys showed me some kind of sound was possible. And when it doesn't matter if the person who was influenced by them goes off and they become the biggest, I guarantee you the biggest stars in the world, and probably like Clapton and those guys, when they met those guys, they were just like overjoyed because they were meeting someone that they'd heard do their thing and were just so like blown away by it. And it was so, you know, it's so unique, and so it's so cool. And there's something that I don't know if you can probably shine some light on this, Phil, but there's a thing with like Al Cooper and Mike Bloomfield, and a little bit with Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. But there was this kind of time, and it was also because it was so politically and culturally a time of upheaval and change, and that music was such a part of that kind of expression of young people, especially not only here in this country, but in England as well. But what I really loved was, and I would say this about Funkadelic and A.D. Hazel and things too, there was a kind of guitar playing that happened
where it was just on the edge of being technically too much for what they wanted to express. And there was this kind of, it kind of broke on the edges. And it was before people became so fast and proficient that it got to be weird and clean again. Or with metal, it really just shredded. But there was this kind of emotional nature to the guitar playing that happened in the late 60s and early 70s that just was, you know, it was like people were playing at the absolute edge of their craft and their instrument, and it was just, you could hear the urgency kind of busting through. And you know, I always loved that about Neil Young's playing too, because he's such a unique voice, and he always played within what he knew how to do incredibly well, but he played it to the edge, and it was neat. But you're right, I mean, I might be an old fogey, but I'm certainly locked into listening to a lot of what I like. That doesn't mean that I'm not open to new things that I learn through your channel or I revisit.
Just before I finish this video, I do want to address that last point that Donal made when he also said that maybe I could shed some light on it. That feeling of a player, and especially in the 60s and the 70s, having that expression in their playing where they're so close to the edge of the cliff, as I've described it before as well on this channel, that it sounds like it's so expressive because it's right on the limit, and the great players never pass that limit and get to the point where they're now messing everything up because they're trying so hard with their playing. And for me, it's something that clearly shows the difference between conscious playing and subconscious playing, and pushing your conscious playing to the limit. Because whenever you're playing a particular run or anything fast on the guitar, all the guitarists out there will know this, that as soon as you have the muscle memory down, you can start to increase the speed as much as you want, as much as you've got patience for, just sitting playing the same run over and over and over again. And then when you do play it, you know that that's a subconscious set of muscle memory movements. You're not thinking about every single note that you're playing, you're just setting off the muscle memory, and that's what's happening. Whereas when you're playing consciously, you are thinking about every single note. And a guitarist will effectively be singing through their guitar because they are thinking of everything that they're putting together rather than just setting off something that is subconscious. I think that distinction between conscious and subconscious playing, as a player, you understand it. But I also think that people can hear it. When somebody's playing a line that they've played 1,000,000 times and may not have even come up with themselves, it's just a scale, an arpeggio. And when they're playing through those, there's no connection there because it's not somebody singing. You'll never hear somebody singing an arpeggio really quickly at 15 notes a second. It's always going to be the difference when a guitarist is playing along to a backing track and they know the key of the backing track. It means that they can just place their shape in position on their fretboard and go through all their muscle memory if they want to. Whereas if the guitarist doesn't know the key and now they have to play along and they have to jam, there's no way that any guitarist is going to instantly jump into a really fast arpeggio, maybe with sweep picking, not knowing what key it's about to be in. You have to wait and respond. So it's that conscious thought of hearing and reacting to whatever you're hearing with your own expression and the notes that you want to play and what you want to say. Donal came up with a great example of Neil Young there, where he's not one of those guys that you would see as a technical guitarist or somebody who's going to be sweep picking arpeggios and alternate picking runs. But the way that he does play is so expressive, that's what communicates to the audience, and that's what the audience connect with, because it's a conscious thought the whole time. His technique on the fretboard isn't so over-rehearsed that it's subconscious. He can be conscious right up to his limit, and right at the limit is where all the best stuff happens. It's where you get all the expression. It's why on those greatest solos of all time lists, there's never a solo that's all played at one tempo. There's always slow sections, mid-tempo sections, and fast sections in there to mix it up, to give you a different feel from the solo. And the solos that do tend to be all one speed generally don't appeal to the masses. Everyone can't really lock into that or hear a conversation in it, and it's something that I've related the guitar to before, having a conversation. So the way that I'd sum it up myself in relation to what Donal said was that, yes, in the late 60s and 70s, there were a lot of conscious players because the speed thing hadn't really taken off, at least not to the point where it was fashionable to play fast. And this really did pick up in the 80s with hard rock and metal and heavy metal, alternate picking, distortion, all of these techniques that had been around with country music, but now they really started to push the envelope of playing speed for speed's sake, because it was now the in thing. I think the two ways to categorize the conscious and subconscious playing is that when you hear a technically great guitarist who is playing consciously and just throwing in a little bit of that subconscious playing, they are playing fast or playing with speed within the confines of musicality and expression. So of course the alternative to that is speed without the confines of musicality and expression, which means that you are now playing for speed's sake. It's a case of how fast can you play this, whether it's a piece or a scale or a particular run that you've practiced. It just becomes a question of how fast, not how relevant. And that's such a difficult point to hit, or a difficult nail to hit on the head, of getting that balance of having speed with relevance. And that's what all the great players do. And there are so many top players technically who do play at impressive speeds, who also nail the expression and the relevance of what they're playing. And that's another thing that the top guitarists can do. They can write a solo that always fits the song, regardless of what that song is, and regardless of the genre. They can just change the way that they sound when they play lead guitar. More often than not, it's because the guitarist is singing through his guitar, and as we all know, once you can learn to sing and you have that ability, you can sing over anything. But thank you guys for watching this video, and thank you to Donal as well for joining me a couple of weeks ago. If you've got any other suggestions for analysis videos, put those in the comments section below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you did enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock!